The theory of evolution. A review. The theory of evolution is probably one of the most important and definitely one of the most misunderstood scientific theories of all time. Opponents to the theory of evolution will say, well, it's only a theory. Well, the answer is yes, it's a scientific theory, and that's significant. So what is a scientific theory? A theory explains how the natural world works. For example, the atomic theory explains how matter behaves by explaining that matter is composed of discrete particles called atoms. Well, how do we know whether it's any good? A good theory is supported by data, lots of data. Data is simply evidence gathered by the senses. For evolution, we have all the data of the fossil record, distribution of plants and animals, phylogenetic relationships, comparative anatomy, embryonic development. The list is long, I won't go on. The theory of evolution is supported by lots of data. But that's not enough. To be a good scientific theory, you have to be able to make testable predictions with that theory. For example, according to the theory of evolution, frogs and salamanders appeared sometime during the Permian in the late Paleozoic. And they're related to each other, so they should have evolved from some common ancestor, an ancestor that had the traits of both a frog and a salamander. However, no one had ever seen any fossil of that ancestor. So that was just prediction until 2004. In 290-million-year-old rock was found the fossil of a frogamander, the ancestor with the traits of both the frog and the salamander. So that prediction came true, as have many others. If, however, that frogamander was found in 2-billion-year-old rock, what would that do to the theory of evolution? It would throw it out. If there was irrefutable evidence that a frogamander existed at a time when, according to the theory of evolution, there were only microorganisms alive on Earth, then something would be terribly wrong. One important trait of any scientific theory is that it must be falsifiable. If irrefutable evidence comes to light that is at odds with your theory, you have to throw out the theory. That's one problem with intelligent design. Intelligent design is given as an alternative to the theory of evolution. It states that some intelligent being, some deity, has shaped the change of life on Earth. Well, you can't prove that, and you can't disprove that. There's nothing remotely scientific about it. It's a matter of faith. You can falsify any theory. Can you prove it? Can you prove the theory of evolution? No, you cannot. By definition, a scientific theory cannot be proven. It will never be a fact. Many scientific theories are so well supported that people treat them as though they're facts. Chemists don't waste time worrying about whether the atomic theory might be false. They simply use it. That doesn't mean that you can't improve upon and expand a theory as new evidence comes to light. The theory of evolution, as proposed by Charles Darwin, has increased considerably over time as we learn more and more. So, evolution can be defined as the change in the genetic makeup of a population over time. That can happen by genetic drift, which is just about what it sounds like, a random change in the genes, or it can happen by natural selection, defined as the way in which some inherited traits increase the likelihood of an individual surviving long enough to pass on those traits to the next generation. It's often referred to as survival of the fittest. Now, the term fittest can lead to a lot of misconceptions. Some people think that means the biggest, the baddest, the toughest. But it simply means having traits that best allow you to not die in your particular environment. So let's take the environment of Southern California. What would be more fit, a house finch or a bald eagle? Well, you only have to look around you to know that the house finch is doing just fine, thank you very much. In fact, it's something of a pest, whereas bald eagles are few and far between. They're not doing well at all. So the house finch must have traits that make it more fit to survive in Southern California than the bald eagle. Here are the main components: of natural selection. First of all, more offspring are born than can survive. If that weren't true, then every population would grow in exponential rates, but they don't. Most offspring will die before they're able to pass on their traits. Second, that there are random mutations which create genetic variation within a population. Now, Charles Darwin had no idea about genetics, but he could see that there were genetic variations within a population, and those are caused by mutations. Now, a mutation is a change in the genes. It's caused by factors like radiation, chemicals, and mutations occur randomly. Most mutations are not good. After all, your DNA is put together that way for a reason. But every once in a while, one of those mutations may be adaptive. That is, they confer some ability to survive better in your particular environment. So individuals that have those adaptive mutations are more likely to survive long enough to reproduce. And by reproducing, they've passed those traits on. Over many generations, the accumulation of adaptive traits will result in a population with a different genetic makeup. In other words, the population has evolved. This happens long enough, the subsequent population may be a totally different species than it was before. Let's look at some common misconceptions about evolution. What evolves, an individual or a population? Individuals don't evolve. They live or they die. A population is what changes over time. That has to do with our misunderstanding of the word adapt or adaptation. In common usage, somebody might say adapt as a behavior. But in evolution, we're talking about an adaptation being a genetic trait that an individual has or does not have. Also, an adaptation is a trait that is useful in one environment, but may not be an adaptation in another environment. I may adapt to the cold weather by putting on a jacket, but that is a behavior. I do not have the adaptation of being able to have warm fur. Now, having warm fur is a great adaptation for living in the Arctic, but it's a genetic trait that would not be adaptive if you lived in the tropics. Another misconception is the idea of amoeba to man, part of the plan. That life began with an amoeba and its purpose was to become more complex and become us. Well, that's a rather self-centered view of it. It's also a very linear view. The idea that there's one way that evolution did go and one way that it could go. And it ended up with us as the end-all and be-all of evolution. Well, evolution should not be seen as something that is linear. Evolution is best described as a tree. Now, on this tree, humans are one part of the process. And we might say, yes, we're the end result of all that evolution. But at the same time, a penguin can say the same thing. A penguin, after all, is the result of all these things that came before. So it's about as silly as us saying that evolution leads to us. Evolution leads to a lot of life. Another misconception is that evolution is random. That really bothers a lot of people. They don't want to believe that they're the result of random chance. Well, evolution is not random. It relies upon natural selection, and there's nothing random about natural selection. One usual argument is that if you took 100 monkeys and put them at 100 typewriters and let them type for 100 years, they would never produce Hamlet. And you're right, they wouldn't. Because there's nothing that is selecting for Hamlet. But I say, if instead you had those 100 monkeys and gave them computers, and you programmed those computers to select anything adaptive to Hamlet and to reject anything that wasn't in Hamlet, then you might get something. After all, if the monkey typed OT, your computer would throw it out. But if he typed TO, keep it. EB, no good. BE, keep it. So it wouldn't take all that long before those 100 monkeys ended up typing to be or not to be. Give them 100 years, they might create Hamlet. Given a few million, who knows what they would create.